Hey friends! Welcome back to the Animal Nerd podcast. I'm your host, the Animal Nerd in question, and I am so happy that you're here. This week, I'm going to be sharing with you the story of a koala who became a symbol of hope in some very dark times. A story of how one small act of kindness went on to have a ripple effect that was felt around the world. This is the story of Sam the koala. As a quick heads up, this episode does feature some heavy topics. A list of content warnings can, as ever, be found in the show notes if you'd like to consult those before listening. We all know that bushfires in Australia are sadly not an uncommon occurrence. We've all seen the awful headlines over the last few years as the frequency and severity of these fires are exacerbated due to climate change. We've seen how many humans and animals have lost their lives to these wildfires, and how countless of survivors have been left affected, either through injury or illness, or through losing their homes and loved ones. It's heartbreaking every time it happens, and it's happening far too often. And that was the same back in February 2009, when the state of Victoria was seeing the worst bushfires it had ever seen. One particularly tragic day, the 7th of February, would come to be known as Black Saturday. On that day alone, the fires burnt over 1 million acres of land, claiming the lives of 173 people, and leaving hundreds more injured. Over 2,000 homes were destroyed. I don't think it's possible to understand the scale of the destruction, and the pain, trauma and fear it left in its wake without having actually experienced it firsthand. So many people were affected by the fires, both directly and indirectly. And yet in all of that darkness and grief, there was one small flicker of light. Something that people found themselves clinging to as a symbol of hope. And that was a picture. A photo of a volunteer firefighter offering a drink of water to a badly burnt koala, who clutched his hand as if in gratitude. It was such a simple act of kindness, such a seemingly small thing, and yet for a lot of people the image was anything but. It became emblematic of the kindness and bravery showed by people as they faced horrors beyond what most of us could even imagine. A symbol of the innocent victims of the fire, both human and animal. It was seen as the embodiment of pure Australian mateship, and it inspired people around the world to get involved in supporting the ongoing relief efforts. But there's a lot more to this story than just one cute photo, and in order to tell it in full, we need to go all the way back to the beginning, to the day that iconic photo was taken. The photo of Sam the koala and her saviour David Tree was first published on the front page of the Herald Sun newspaper on Tuesday the 10th of February 2009, 3 days after Black Saturday. From there it immediately went viral, and it was often reported that the photo was taken on Black Saturday itself, something which added to the romance and fairy tale of it all, that such a beautiful moment could happen on such a dark and tragic day. But that's not actually the case. In fact, Sam the koala wasn't even in the wild on Black Saturday. Rather, the events that would become immortalised in that iconic photo took place on the 1st of February, a week before the day that would come to be known as Black Saturday. Wildfires were already raging in the region, and in an effort to try and control the fires and prevent them from becoming too big and too dangerous, this team of firefighters were out on a backburning operation. Backburning, also known as controlled burning, is a process whereby fires are intentionally set and then carefully controlled and extinguished. This might seem counterproductive. I mean, it's quite literally fighting fire with fire, but it is actually an effective form of wildfire management. By deliberately igniting certain areas, you're burning up all of the natural fuel that could otherwise feed a much larger fire, thus either reducing the intensity of a later wildfire or preventing the fire from passing through a certain area, which can help protect human settlements. The goal isn't to stop wildfires entirely, that would be impossible, and even if it wasn't, wildfires are actually a natural part of many ecosystems, and indeed are essential for some plants to spread their seeds, and they also improve soil quality. Controlled burning like this was done for centuries by the indigenous peoples of Australia, and their careful management made the land a better, richer place to live for humans, animals and plant life alike. And then European colonisers arrived on the scene, and decided that they knew how to manage their newly stolen land better than the people who'd been doing so for generations, and immediately ruined everything. So wildfires aren't a bad thing in and of themselves, but in recent years they've become far worse than ever before, and that's primarily as a result of climate change, and that's why managing the spread of wildfires through things like backburning has become so important. And that's exactly what these firefighters were in the process of doing when one of them, a volunteer from the County Fire Authority, noticed a koala struggling to walk on badly burnt paws as she made her way through a burnt-out area. She was clearly in a bad way, and so the fire engine pulled over to see if there was anything they could do to help her. I think the best person to tell the story is David Tree himself. This is how he described the encounter to local newspaper The Age. Quote, "At first she was really wary, then she just plonked down and it was like, 'You're a big predator, but I'm sore, I'm beat, I'm done.' She was in pain. And she just looked up at me. So I yelled out for a bottle of water, and she started lapping it up." End quote. And it wasn't just one bottle of water. Sam gulped down 3 bottles in quick succession. David had initially tried to pour the water into his hand for her to drink, but she was so thirsty that she drank directly from the bottle, resting one of her paws in David's outstretched hand. And this whole encounter was unique for a few reasons. Firstly, there was the obvious, that it's incredibly rare to get this up close and personal to a wild koala. Perhaps Sam knew that these people wanted to help her. Or perhaps she was so tired, so dehydrated and in so much pain that it overrode her natural fear. Either way, even just drinking water like that was incredibly unusual for a koala. They aren't actually a species that typically drink water the way most of us mammals do. I mean, of course they will sometimes, but generally speaking, they get most of the water they need from the leaves they eat. In fact, the word koala comes from the Aboriginal Durug word gula, which means no water. So the fact that an animal whose species is literally named after the fact that they barely ever drink decided to strain 3 bottles of water in quick succession shows you what a poor state Sam was in, and how desperate she was for help. Knowing what a once-in-a-lifetime experience this was, David got one of his fellow firefighters, Mark Pardue, to film it and take some photos on his mobile. David had never intended for the photos or video to go viral and become the face of the 2009 Victorian wildfires. He filmed the video because he wanted to show it to his daughter, that was all. And you can tell that from the fact that he makes a dad joke in it. When we're fighting the fires, how much can a koala bear? There is literally nothing that can stop a dad from making a dad joke, and I am so here for it. The video is less than 2 minutes long, and it's pretty crunchy given that it was recorded on a 2000s mobile phone, but I would still highly recommend going and giving it a watch if you've never seen it. It's honestly one of the most adorable and heartwarming things I've ever seen. It's so cute, and it will absolutely restore your faith in humanity. The firefighters couldn't hang around for long though, as they received an emergency call out to protect a house, and so they had to leave Sam behind. And like I said, the photo, the videos, none of that was ever intended to go viral. David never did any of this for the attention, and he had no idea what stopping to help that koala would end up snowballing into. He emailed the photo out to some people he knew because he thought they might like to see them, and from there I guess someone sent them to the Herald Sun, and the rest, as they say, is history. The video was uploaded to YouTube, where it instantly started racking up views, and that beautiful photo of Sam resting her paw in David's hand was reprinted in newspapers and on websites around the world. Everyone was obsessed with the story of Sam the koala, and no one could get enough. But what actually became of Sam? Well, I'm pleased to say that she was rescued by a team of trained volunteers from Wildlife Rescue and Protection Inc., and it was not an easy operation. They found Sam a good 15 metres or so up a tree, and while she might have been willing to accept help from humans once, that seemed to be her limit, and she refused to come down. It took well over an hour before they finally managed to encourage Sam down. It can't have been a pleasant job in the summer heat with wildfires raging all around, but they didn't let that deter them, and they refused to give up on Sam. And this was also about when she was given the name Sam, because of the place she was found, Sampson Road. The wildfires were having a devastating impact on local wildlife, and so triage centres for them were set up around the affected areas. Once an animal was safely captured, they would be rushed to the nearest one to be assessed. Unfortunately, some animals were in such a bad way that they had to be euthanised almost immediately, when it became clear that they would never recover from the injuries they'd sustained in the fire. Sam, though, was not one of those animals, and on Sunday the 8th of February she was sent to the Southern Ash Wildlife Shelter, where she would be rehabilitated and cared for until she could return to the wild. Only 2 days later, the photo of Sam and David made headlines, and the wildlife shelter was immediately hit with a barrage of media interest, with news companies from all over the world wanting to interview Sam's carers and be able to come and film the famous koala in person. The Southern Ash Wildlife Centre is staffed entirely by volunteers, and is run out of the family home of its founder, Colleen Wood. Eventually they needed to have 2 volunteers just to man the phones, and they would end up receiving over 30,000 emails. It became so much that in the end a legal firm offered their services pro bono to manage all media inquiries. Sam was nothing short of an international superstar. And you might think all of this media attention was a good thing for the shelter. After all, with that level of exposure and that many people in love with Sam, there must have been a lot of people who felt moved to donate or support the shelter in other ways, and I don't doubt that there were. But the constant media inquiries became something of a double-edged sword, because while all of this was going on, the fires continued burning across Victoria, and wild animals continued to find themselves in desperate need of rescue, but the incoming calls about these were getting buried in the thousands of phone calls asking for interviews and updates. And even when they received calls about wildlife in need, it was also much harder to coordinate the search and rescue efforts for them, because that was all done over the phone back then. Not to mention the fact that no one at the shelter would have been expecting this. They took Sam in before anyone else knew who she was, and they had no way of knowing that she would be any different from the 50+ other koalas they rescued from the fires that year. One cute thing that arose from the flurry of media attention, though, was that David Tree had the opportunity to visit the shelter and be reunited with Sam, where they got some honestly adorable photos of the 2 touching noses. David later told Gold Coast News that while he didn't know whether or not she recognised him, he liked to think that she did. Even though David hadn't been able to rescue Sam when he first found her, he was still very much her saviour. Colleen Wood, the founder of the Southern Ash Wildlife Shelter, said that Sam may well not have survived had it not been for David offering her a drink. Otherwise, she probably would have succumbed to dehydration before the rescue team had a chance to find her. Sam was still in a bad way when she was brought into the shelter, though. She'd been badly burnt by the fire. The skin around her eyes was badly blistered. She'd sustained second-degree burns to both her front legs and third-degree burns to her hind feet. She was also underweight, which isn't uncommon for koalas rescued from traumatising situations. The combination of shock and dehydration caused them to lose up to 10% of their overall body weight. It was clear that trying to bring Sam back to full health would be no mean feat, but if anyone could do it, then the team at the Southern Ash Wildlife Shelter certainly could. Although they'd taken animals from a range of different native Australian species, koalas are their specialty, and Sam was one of only many of her kind that they rescued during those terrible bushfires of 2009. Sam quickly became a firm favourite amongst the shelter volunteers. She was described as quiet and well-behaved, and she was much more cooperative during her treatments than most of the other koalas, who could be pretty feisty as you'd expect from a wild animal. And it wasn't just the humans that seemed to adore Sam. The babies at the shelter all seemed to love her, and Sam loved them right back, despite the fact that she'd probably never had babies of her own. It was estimated when she was first rescued that she was between 2 and 4 years old, and female koalas don't typically start breeding until they're 3 or 4, but it was clear that if she ever had the chance to be a mother, then she'd be a great one. And perhaps it wouldn't be all too long before Sam found herself raising her own babies, because perhaps her biggest admirer at the shelter was another rescued koala, a male named Bob, who in media coverage was often referred to as her boyfriend. Bob had been rescued 2 days before Sam, and was estimated to be 4 years old. He was in a similar state to Sam, with third-degree burns on 3 of his paws, although his injuries must have been less extensive, as it was estimated that it would only take about 4 months of healing and rehabilitation until he was ready to be returned to the wild, whereas for Sam it was believed that it could take approximately double that time. But even if they couldn't be released together, at least they had each other when they were both recovering at the shelter. They were practically inseparable and would often put their arms around each other. As was the case earlier, I think the best people to share what Sam was like were those who actually knew her, and because I'm way too shy and socially anxious to actually reach out to people for comments or interviews, I'm once again going to read a quote from somewhere else. This is how Vicky Hams, a volunteer at the shelter, described her to Museums Victoria. She was a particularly placid, sweet-natured koala. She loved her formula and gobbled it down with gusto each morning and evening, and would crawl across the branch to reach for it hungrily. She did not try to bite when having her bandages changed or her injections or her eye drops. She patiently allowed the joeys to crawl on her back or on her head and would have made a good mother herself. I have a wonderful photo of a joey plonked on the head of the sleeping Sam. Sam snored when she slept. She adored a selection of various gum leaves and, again, greedily ate the best gum immediately when it was replenished in her enclosure. While the world's media clamoured for the latest updates on Sam, the volunteers at the Southern Ash Wildlife Shelter dedicated themselves to helping her heal, and it was an intense process. Her paws had to be bandaged up while the burns healed, and the bandages needed to be changed daily to prevent infection. On top of that, she was also receiving daily antibiotics, also to prevent infection from setting in on her paws or around her eyes, and of course she also received pain relief to help her cope. I can't imagine how much those burns must have hurt her. She also needed eye drops to help heal the damage done there, and special supplemental feeds to help build her back up as she'd lost a lot of weight throughout the stress of it all. Honestly, I have so much respect for people who work in wildlife rehabilitation. The amount of time and energy it must take to help an animal in that kind of state, to say nothing of the emotional toll it must have on you, and to do that day in, day out for so many animals, nothing but respect. I don't think I'd have what it takes to do that. I mentioned earlier in this episode that the viral popularity of Sam's photo inspired people from around the world to support the bushfire relief efforts. And while some of that was just in general from people seeing the photo and being moved enough to donate on their own, there were also some more organised attempts to capitalise on the photo's popularity and help as many people and animals as possible. One example of this was the Herald Sun, who sold copies of that iconic photo to people from all around the world. They sold over 5,000 in total, raising $300,000 for good causes. There was also an initiative called Bushfire Aid, which was a compilation CD put together where all of the proceeds and royalties would be donated to the Victorian bushfire appeal. It featured songs from 35 artists from Australia and around the world, with a star-studded lineup containing such names as Bruce Springsteen, Billy Joel, Beyoncé, Justin Timberlake, Eurythmics, Whitney Houston, Dido, Westlife, and many more. That's all well and good, but what does this have to do with our darling Sam? Well, Sony Music, who put the CD together, decided that the perfect image for the cover would be that photo of Sam and David. And I don't doubt that featuring her so front and centre would have encouraged more people to purchase the CD if they weren't already swayed by the star power in the track list. There's really no telling just how much of an impact Sam had, how much money was raised that might not otherwise have been, and how many lives were changed for the better thanks to her. The people of Victoria, the people of Australia, adored Sam in a way that very few animals or people will ever experience. When the online American tabloid TMZ decided to make a pretty tasteless joke about Sam's photo, they were immediately met by a backlash from furious Australians. Sam was seen as the face of the victims of the Australian bushfires, including the hundreds of humans who lost their lives, so people were understandably fuming that TMZ would think it appropriate to make light of the situation, and ultimately the publication retracted their initial coverage and issued an apology. Back at the wildlife shelter, Sam flourished under the expert care of the volunteers, and by mid-March her front feet had healed enough that she was able to finally have the bandages removed, and she decided to celebrate her newly regained dexterity by escaping from her enclosure overnight and then scaling a desk. Perhaps after such exertion she decided she needed a rest, because once on top of the desk she decided to sit down on the shelter's brand new fax machine, which then immediately broke because I guess the ability to withstand the full weight of an adult koala wasn't something the manufacturers thought was important. I can't imagine why. A couple of weeks after her front bandages were removed, Sam was doing so well that she was able to finally graduate to an outdoor enclosure, one step further on her journey of returning to the wild, and only 2 months after being rescued. Things were certainly starting to look up for Sam, for the most part. She still needed those special supplemental feedings to help her regain weight, but what became of increasing concern was the blistering around her eyes, which didn't seem to be getting better despite the ongoing treatment, and this began to raise some suspicions in Sam's carers. You've probably heard that weird little factoid going around that all koalas have chlamydia. That's not true. Not because koalas don't get that illness, they absolutely do, but because it's not something that every single koala has. Although, that being said, it is very widespread. At the time of Sam's rescue, most sources estimated that about 50% of koalas had it, whereas now it's believed that anywhere up to 89% of wild populations may be affected, and it's also common in captive koalas around the world. They're particularly vulnerable to the bacteria and the illness that it causes, and it's a massive problem. It's actually one of the leading causes of their continued decrease in numbers. And what's one of the most common symptoms of chlamydia in koalas? Inflammation around the eyes. So you can see why Sam's carers became suspicious when the area around her eyes just didn't want to heal. All rescued koalas were tested for chlamydiosis when they were first brought into the shelter, including Sam, and her initial test had come back negative. However, by the 7th of May, Sam began to show signs of urinary issues, and that, combined with the ongoing eye issues, was enough to warrant a second test being done, and this time the results came back positive. It must have felt like a real blow to her hopes of recovery. But, as I said, chlamydiosis is common in koala populations, and it can be treated in captivity, though it's not an easy feat. Chlamydia can cause all kinds of chronic issues for koalas, including blindness and infertility, and ultimately will lead to a slow, painful death if left untreated. Obviously, Sam was immediately put onto treatment to try and help her beat this illness. After all that she'd overcome already, she couldn't be beaten now. And for a while, she seemed to be doing mostly okay. And then, at the end of July, her weight suddenly dropped by a full kilogram. This led to her having an ultrasound which determined that she had ovarian cysts caused by her illness, and would need surgery to remove them. However, when they opened Sam up, they found that the disease was far more advanced than anyone had realised, and there was nothing that could be done. It was so severe that it was untreatable, and the only thing the vets could do was to put her to sleep rather than bringing her round from the anaesthetic. I can't imagine how hard it must have been for the volunteers who had spent the past 6 months caring for Sam, but ending her suffering before it became too severe was the only thing that could be done. It was one final act of kindness for the koala who had done so much for so many people. Ask anyone who's involved in the field of animal rescue what the hardest part of it is, and they'll tell you the same thing. It's the fact that you can't save them all. Some animals are simply too far gone, no matter how much time, love, money, work, and expertise you put into trying to save them, and that's not something that ever gets easier. But in the case of Sam, it wasn't just those who knew her personally who were affected by her passing. People across the country, across the world, were all grieving the loss of this Australian hero. The then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd even spoke out about it, describing Sam's loss as tragic. Perhaps it isn't surprising that the koala who raised so much awareness for good causes continued to do so even after she was gone. What happened to her was awful, but she was only one of countless koalas who had lost their lives to chlamydia, and because she was so high profile, her death shone a light on the threat posed to her species by the bacteria and probably went on to inspire more people to get involved in koala conservation. Which obviously isn't to say that her passing was a good thing, far from it. It would have been far better for her to be able to recover and return to the wild, but at least there was a silver lining that might have gone on to help save other koalas from the same fate. The team at the Southern Ash Wildlife Shelter wanted to bury Sam in the same area that they'd planned to release her, so that she could still return to her home in some form. However, that decision wasn't up to them. You see, koalas are a protected species, which means the fate of her body could only be decided by the Department of Sustainability and Environment. And they felt the best thing to be done would be for her to go to Museums Victoria, where she could then be skin stuffed and put on display, since she was such a cultural icon, and they felt she still had the power to educate the public about koala conservation and bushfires, even though she was no longer alive. It seems that the team from the wildlife shelter really didn't like this decision, and I don't blame them. I imagine it must feel violating to have an animal you knew and loved being taken apart and then put on public display like an inanimate object. But I also understand why the DSE wanted Sam to end up in a museum, where she could continue to help educate and inspire people, especially now as dangerous wildfires have continued to become more frequent and intense due to climate change, and as koala populations continue to struggle for a multitude of reasons. It wasn't until May 2010, almost a year after her death, when Sam's body was finally put on display in the Melbourne Museum, where she remains to this day, a symbol of both hope and loss. The museum made the decision to preserve her body in a state of semi-recovery, with bandages still on her hind legs as a tribute to the loss and pain caused by the 2009 fires. And that wasn't the only tribute to Sam. If you ever visit an area of Victoria called Dadswells Bridge, the first thing you'll notice is the 14-metre tall giant koala statue, which is known creatively as the Giant Koala. This 12-ton metal sculpture has stood proudly in place since 1989, and is your pretty typical tourist trap, complete with a souvenir shop located in the koala's crotch. Like, I don't know if they really thought through where they were putting that door, but yeah, it looks a little strange. And apparently the shop is no longer open as of last year anyway, so I guess its crotch is just empty nowadays. I'm going to stop talking about the giant koala's crotch now, I'm getting a bit uncomfortable. My point in bringing all this up is that shortly after Sam's passing, it was decided to name the giant koala after Sam, as a tribute to her that would hopefully also raise both awareness of koala chlamydia and funds for the Southern Ash Wildlife Shelter. The official renaming happened in September, as that saved the Koala Month, and David Tree was invited along as a guest of honour. I'm kind of wishing now that this episode could also come out in September, but I don't have time to get a different one ready for this week. Oh well. And that's the story of Sam the koala. Honestly, there were plenty more rabbit holes I could have gone down. When I started researching for this episode, I wasn't sure if I'd have to do it as a mini-sode, but it turns out there is a lot of stuff out there about Sam, which I suppose isn't surprising given the virality of that picture, although I can't say I'd actually ever seen or heard of it before I started on this episode. But I really enjoyed getting to learn about Sam and her story and the people involved in helping rescue her, and I hope you did too. The Southern Ash Wildlife Shelter is still up and running and rescuing koalas. And as is always the case when I cover a story that involves a non-profit, I will have links to them in the show notes if you'd like to go and donate to them or support them in any other way. They currently rescue over 120 koalas every single year, and they have plans to expand their facilities, including building a specialist burns unit. But obviously that's expensive, and they are funded entirely through donations. So if you did feel moved by Sam's story, then it would be awesome if you donated to that if you are able to. Unfortunately, this podcast isn't currently monetized, otherwise I would absolutely be donating a portion of the proceeds to them. But I will still be making a donation out of my own pocket because you know how we feel about supporting animal rescue around here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd Podcast. New episodes come out every single Tuesday, plus bonus minisodes randomly in between, so you should subscribe to the show so that you never miss one. A full list of sources used in this episode, as well as our contact info and social media, can be found in the show notes, as always. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the show, then it would mean the world to me if you left us a nice review or rating, told your friends about it, whatever you can do. I really do appreciate it more than words can say. I'll be back here next Tuesday with another brand new animal story to share, although I haven't decided what that's going to be yet, and until then, stay wild, friends.